In order to get the bots to speak to each other with these particular political valences, we use news articles from the online media tracking database MediaCloud. MediaCloud tracks the news articles published by various media websites and allows one to collect the articles together into separate bins. We based our initial attempts on using these bins as the basis for constructing the training data for the bots. As we can see here, the bins are constructed based on associations with Twitter users and a particular judgment of their own location on the political spectrum. The sources are collected based on the frequency of their shares by an undefined group of Twitter users. We have US center right, US center left, US right, US left, and then US center, which we did not end up using for the final bot construction. These pre-sorted bins are based on a particular proxy or metric, Twitter URL shares, that's clearly based off of some algorithmic sorting and categorization of Twitter users into different locations on a horizontal political spectrum. If we look at one of these bins, for example, you can see that it's pretty highly unlikely that this amount of data was collected and sorted by a human actor. These bins are provided by MediaCloud themselves, but MediaCloud doesn't publish any information on how the initial sorting mechanism was used or constructed. The assumption is that measuring a news website's political valence through the language or views expressed on Twitter accounts is implicit in this sorting. This is what each bin looks like. The US right one, for example, has a collection of media websites that the initial Twitter sorting algorithm has associated with the right wing of the US political spectrum. In order to set up an antagonistic, discursive relationship between the bots, we attempted to pull articles based on three issues that we thought would pull out contrasts in sentiment: climate change, COVID-19, and immigration. MediaCloud allows us to collect all articles in these bins and then query for terms, so we placed the US left and center left bins together and the US right and center right bins together to sort for these issues. We then downloaded all of the URLs that were available and that showed up for each of those collected left and right bins. This is what one of those Excel files looks like, the collection of URLs. As you can see here, it contains the headline, we have the URL itself, the website it came from, and some other information. What we did from here was to grab all of the article URLs and use a web scraper to scrape the content of the articles. We then attempted to train the bots on these articles. But we encountered a problem. Even when attempting a preliminary run with just 1,000 articles, we found that the bots were not speaking in the polarized language that we wanted them to. Instead, there was lots of randomness and factual sounding statements. This makes the opacity of MediaCloud's initial sorting algorithms all the more problematic. If the reverse of the algorithmic sorting of news bias based on Twitter proxies leads to this relatively quotidian and at times nonsensical discursive exchange, then is a Twitter user's calculated political valence really a useful proxy for the bias of news media? It was clear that just using the MediaCloud bins wasn't going to work. And so we switched tacks. From this initial sample of 1,000 articles, we decided to narrow down to 50 hand-selected articles that fit the profiles of the progressive activist and the devoted conservative, as defined by More in Common's Hidden Tribes report. I should note here that while this was used with permission, More in Common was not a contributor or partner of the performance, and the performance nor this video essay represents the views of More in Common. The articles were hand-selected by our production manager, Madeline Greenberg. By adopting the persona of Nick in the performance and Kimberly in the performance, she read the list of headlines in the Excel file and selected articles that would be most likely to grab the attention of each persona. With these selected articles, the bots were able to converse with each other and the user polemically and from a polarized state, as Rupa's video goes into further detail about. There are a few reasons why this curation was ultimately the way that the bots had to be constructed. Whenever one is using natural language processing libraries, you want to train them on documents of words that are already configured and work properly according to human grammatical syntax. By using news articles, we're thus training the bots to speak according to the vocabularies, syntaxes, and phrasal constructs in news writing that's delimited by these particular categories. So what ends up happening when we use such a large dataset to train the bots is that they end up constructing factual statements and adopting the quote-unquote objective tone of news journalism. Through this reconstruction of language, we can see that there's a critique of the algorithmic sorting of news media based on Twitter user political valence. Through the construction of homophilic neighborhoods and their abstraction away from particular political sentiment or environments that Twitter users, as models of the bots themselves, find themselves having discussions within, using these bins illustrated a certain level of difference that is not visible to the average user, yet played an important part in the sorting. Thus, as calculated and presented as discrete and distinct from each other, located at different edges of a horizontal political spectrum, the degree to which these algorithms and the platforms that are implicated in both their construction and iteration are involved in the construction of a perhaps artificial difference is made clear. While platforms present themselves to consumers and the legal system as agoric spaces that allow for the unfettered spread of speech and user agency, what we can see through these invisible sorting processes is a construction of difference at play. Considering that we don't know how exactly these Twitter users were originally sorted into political positions, besides a functional description of the sorting's end result, somewhere along the line, there's a construction of difference that can't be replicated when we try to construct the bots based off of the news articles that supposedly indicate this difference. These differences are then difficult to directly associate with dialogic language. When we tried trimming the sampling down to Madeline's curation, we accepted that the most commonly used machine learning natural language processing libraries can't necessarily detect these marginal political spaces of dialogue. If we think of how natural language processing operates, this might begin to make more sense. By trimming the articles used for training, we overfitted the aberrations from normal human speech that make up the activating and marginal rhetorical political techniques that characterize online political spaces. Using the most commonly available NLP libraries, this can't be detected. This is because NLP splits words up into tokens and then defines these tokens and their sentiments based on the context of the training set, which is not necessarily what a Twitter user themselves might encounter or bring into the encounter. It's just the tokenization of news articles. So the bots that were constructed from these news articles, in a sense, they talked past each other. They shared a space, but they're not necessarily listening. And that's ultimately what the question on political dialogic spaces is about. It's about the production of utterances versus the question of listening, and of hearing the other in their entirety before the encounter is stamped with one's own space.